You're listening to the Learn Like a CPA podcast, where we talk about all things real estate, tax strategy, and personal finance. Whether you're a real estate investor looking to scale your portfolio, or you're an individual wanting to take your financial freedom journey to the next level, this is a podcast for you. Hey everyone, before we get into the podcast today, I want to tell you about a brand new educational opportunity that I'm offering. Coming up in February, I'm releasing a comprehensive tax course for short-term rental investors. This course is designed to teach you everything you need to know to make confident tax decisions that will save you hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of your investing journey. Listeners of the Learn Like a CPA show can use the promo code PODCAST20 to receive 20% off of the course. To learn more, go to the link in my show notes and you can sign up for the pre-launch. There you will be notified when the course drops. And now let's get into the show. Welcome back everyone to the Learn Like a CPA show. I'm your host, Ryan Bakey today. Today we're going to cover a few different topics and how they all interplay together. So we're going to talk about the BRRRR Method and why you should add another step to the BRRRR Method. We're going to talk about a new concept that I've never seen anybody ever talk about before, which is called equity stripping. And we're also going to talk about another concept that I've never seen anybody talk about before, which is a wherewithal to pay problem. So to start off the BRRRR Method, right, I have the patented book here, right? Buy, rehab, rent, refinance, and repeat. This is a proven wealth building strategy that's helped thousands, hundreds of thousands of people build an insane amount of wealth, right? Buy, rehab, rent it, refinance, and repeat. But I'm here today to tell you guys that you want to add an extra step to your BRRRR Method, okay? You want to buy the property, you want to rehab it, you want to make the property available for rent, okay? Rent ready. So add another R, buy, rehab, make it rent ready, rent it, refinance, repeat. And you might say, well, why would you want to do that? Well, you have to understand that once the property, all the costs when you buy a property, between when you buy it and when you start renting it out, those costs have to be capitalized and depreciated. It's just a fancy term for you're not going to get your tax benefit immediately. You're going to get that benefit over a lifetime of the property. Okay? If you depreciate something, you don't get the benefit immediately. You get it stretched out over a period of years, and you also have to pay this thing called depreciation recapture. Okay, when you're able to expense something, you get an immediate tax benefit for expensing that, and you don't have to pay depreciation recapture because you never depreciated anything, you expensed it. And so let me give you guys an example, and this was one of my more recent projects where let's say I bought a property June 1, so 6/1, and the property was ready to go August 1st. Let's say I started renting it out August 1st. And in between when I bought it and when I started renting it out, I had $30,000 worth of rehab costs. Well, if I'm able to do enough rehab, get the property permitted, get the water running, get all the utilities hooked up, and get the property rent ready, which means I'm advertising it for rent, which I'm listing it on Airbnb, I'm listing it on Vrbo, I put a for sale or for rent sign out front. I get that property available to rent on July 1st. And let's say I have $15,000 costs before July 1st and $15,000 of costs after July 1st. What does this mean? Well, these $15,000 of costs before the property is rent ready is going to be depreciated over the life of the asset. Can't do anything about those costs. However, those costs that we incur after the property is available for rent can be expensed immediately. Okay, so we talked about over here, these costs, we're not going to get this benefit for 27 and a half years. We're going to do 15,000 divided by 27 and a half. That's pennies. Whereas this 15,000 that we spend after the property is rent ready, available for rent, we can expense this immediately against our marginal tax bracket. Let's say I'm in a 40% tax bracket. I'm going to get that benefit of $6,000 in tax savings in this year, as opposed to having to capitalize and depreciate it, which I don't get as much of a benefit. This is just adding a simple extra step to the BRRRR Method. Now, can you go crazy with this? Can you say the property is available for rent, but it's still on studs or it's still getting framed? No, the property has to be ready for rent. But assuming you're able to do that, you're able to get all your permits and your occupancy. This is a great strategy, and all it is the same thing that you've been doing, but just add another step to the BRRRR method again. So add another R, right? We talked about buy, rehab, make it available for rent, rent it, refinance, and repeat, right? So that buy, rehab, rent, ready, make it available for rent. That's the extra step. The next concept we're going to talk about today is what's called equity stripping. And so equity stripping is where you have tons of equity in some of your properties, whether rental properties, primary home, investment properties. You have tons of equity built up in those properties. Well, what happens is the more equity you have in properties, the more appetizing you are to potential lawsuits, creditors, and debtors, etc. And you oftentimes want to get the equity out of those properties so they're not as appetizing for risk seekers, right? People who want to come after you personally. And so this involves doing HELOCs or cash out refinances and getting the value out of those properties so that way in the event of a lawsuit, there's really nothing there for them to come after. I would recommend stripping the equity out in your personal name rather than a business because you're going to get better rates and terms and financing conditions, etc. So if you have property that's in heavily appreciated areas recently, the last couple of years, like California, Florida, Smoky Mountains, consider removing the equity out of those properties and placing that equity in newer properties. Spread out your risk. I did a recent podcast a couple of weeks ago on the idea of how leverage impacts real estate and how actually having 5 properties, putting 20% down on each rather than having one $100,000 property is actually more safer because you're spreading out your risk over 5 properties as opposed to only one. And so equity stripping is just this concept of you're taking the equity out of your properties to make you less appetizing to debtors and creditors and lawsuits, etc. And in fact, you're spreading out your risk because you're going to be buying more property and spreading your assets across different markets. The last conversation that gets brought up with this is what I call a wherewithal to pay problem. And I don't see anybody ever talking about this, and it's because we're not thinking 10 steps ahead here. Okay, suppose you buy a property and you put $100,000 down. I'm sorry, you buy a property for $100,000, putting 20% down. You're going to put $100,000 into it, so I'm all in it for $120,000, and now let's say the property's worth $300,000. Okay, well, what am I going to do? If I'm doing the BRRRR method, I'm going to take a loan out on the $300,000 at an 80% loan to value. So I have a $300,000 property, and I'm going to take a loan out for $240,000, and I'm going to leave $60,000 equity in the property. Some years later, that property is going to go up in value, right? So now my $300,000 property may now be worth $500,000, let's say. And then I'm going to decide to take out another loan against the appreciated value of the property. And so this time I'm going to take the same 80% LTV of $500,000. And so now I have a $400,000 loan. I then decide to sell the property 6 months later or a year later for $500,000, what it's worth. You, my friend, have a problem, a wherewithal to pay problem. You see, because you sold the property for $500,000, but after paying realtor commissions of $30,000 and also having to pay off that bank loan of $400,000, you're left with $65,000 cash after closing, right? You walk away with $65,000. The problem is you have a capital gain, assuming you're not tax strategizing or planning. You have a capital gain on the difference between the amount of money that you bought the property for, which was $100,000, plus the $100,000 that you put in renovations. You have a $200,000 cost basis, and you sold the property for $500,000. Those refinances, those HELOCs, those debt that you take out subsequent to buying the property, those are not changing your tax position, right? Because a refinance is not a taxable event. So you sold the property for $500,000 that you had $200,000 cost basis in for a gain of $300,000. And long-term capital gains, if you've been following along, are taxed at 0, 15, or 20 based on your marginal tax bracket, based on your income that year. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility for your capital gain tax on this sale to be $60,000. And that's not including state income tax, net investment income tax, etc. So you have $65,000 cash you walk away from the sale with, but you have to pay a $60,000 tax bill. That's what happens if you don't strategize or you plan. if you're going to be borrowing a lot of money against the appreciated value of your properties, you want to keep in mind this when you go to close, or I'm sorry, when you go to sell. When you go to sell your property, you're going to want to see how much equity, what is your equity position in that property, because you could be stuck paying a huge tax bill that very well could be more than the size of the proceeds that you get when you sell the property. Do not get stuck with this problem, and make sure you tax strategize around this event. You can 1031 exchange your property. You can accelerate depreciation on other properties. Do things that are going to lower your tax bracket, and so you're not stuck with this wherewithal to pay problem. All right, guys, I know I went through that a little bit fast. We covered why you should add an extra step to the BRRRR method. We talked about equity stripping, which is something I've never seen anybody do. And then lastly, we talked about a wherewithal to pay problem that I've never seen anybody also talk about either. We covered those topics today, looped them together. If you have any questions or comments, make sure to let me know at Learn Like a CPA. I have a website, learnlikeacpa.com. You can hit me up on Instagram or TikTok at Learn Like a CPA. And if you like the show, make sure you leave a review on Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you're listening to this, because it helps me out. And we'll see you guys on the next episode.